The morning was crisp, with the sun beginning to rise higher, casting golden hues across the city. The streets were crowded with tourists, locals, and commuters heading in every direction. In the midst of the hustle and bustle, near a famous landmark, a royal guard stood still, his uniform pristine and his posture as straight as an arrow. His job was simple in appearance: stand at attention, guard the historic monument, and remain calm, no matter what happened around him. However, for the royal guard, this routine was important. It wasn't just a job. It was a duty to his country and the royal family he served. His gaze was steady, his face expressionless, though his sharp eyes scanned the crowd. The guard was used to the curious glances and whispers that followed him, but today felt a little different. The air was thick with the usual city noise, but something about the way the crowd was moving suggested that today might bring something unexpected. Most people were too distracted by their phones or talking to notice anything out of the ordinary, but a few sharp-eyed observers took notice of a woman weaving her way through the crowd toward the royal guard. This woman, who appeared to be in her mid-40s, was dressed in a way that screamed impatience. Her movements were swift and purposeful, her eyes scanning the surroundings as though she were on a mission. Her steps were heavy, her face twisted with annoyance, and her clenched jaw told anyone looking that she wasn't in the mood for anything that would slow her down. She seemed to have no regard for the people around her, almost pushing them aside as she made her way forward. As she got closer to the royal guard, something in her expression shifted. A look of disdain crossed her face, followed by a quick glance down at his uniform. The royal guard remained motionless, fully aware of her approach, but doing nothing to show it. He had been trained to maintain his composure in any situation, no matter how challenging. The woman stopped in front of him, barely a few feet away, and without any warning, she looked down at the coffee cup she had been carrying. In one swift motion, she hurled the hot liquid at the guard's uniform, the dark coffee splashing across his chest and staining his crisp attire. The crowd around them gasped, some stepping back in shock, while others seemed too stunned to react. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The royal guard stood unmoving, the hot coffee dripping down his uniform. His face betrayed no emotion, his eyes locked on the woman before him, but his body remained perfectly still, as though this was just another ordinary moment in a long line of many. The woman, on the other hand, stood there for a moment, her lips curling into a smirk, clearly pleased with herself for having made such a bold statement. She had done something unexpected, something rebellious. But as she stood there waiting for some kind of reaction, she noticed the guard didn't budge. He didn't flinch, didn't shout, didn't even look angry. Instead, he simply continued to stand at attention, his eyes unwavering as if he were a statue. The crowd, at first silent in shock, began to murmur. Some were filming with their phones, eager to capture the scene unfolding in front of them. The woman's smirk started to fade as she realized her act of defiance wasn't having the effect she expected. People were beginning to talk, and the whispers started to grow louder. The woman's small act of rebellion was quickly turning into a spectacle she hadn't bargained for. She had expected some kind of reaction, but what she had gotten was an even more intense silence, a silence that spoke volumes about the guard's discipline and control. In that moment, the woman began to feel the weight of her actions, though she refused to admit it. The crowd, once indifferent to her presence, was now fully focused on her, and she could feel their eyes on her, waiting to see what she would do next. But the royal guard didn't move, didn't say a word. He simply stood there, as dignified and unflappable as ever, a symbol of calm in the face of her chaotic energy. As the hot coffee soaked into the royal guard's uniform, the crowd around them seemed to react in waves. First, there was a collective gasp, followed by whispers that spread like wildfire. Some of the onlookers stepped back, unsure of what would happen next, while others, with their phones already out, began recording the incident. It was clear that everyone was expecting a reaction, any kind of reaction, from the guard. But what they saw next was far from what they anticipated. The woman stood there, almost waiting for the guard to snap, to show anger, or at least show some sign that her actions had affected him. But instead, he remained completely still. His expression didn't shift. There was no anger, no surprise, not even a flinch. His gaze remained unwavering, locked on her, but there was no sign of any emotion. His composure was remarkable, his stance firm, as if he had been through this kind of thing 1,000 times before and knew exactly how to handle it. The woman began to feel the weight of her actions. For a moment, she had been the one in control. She had thrown the coffee, believing she would get some kind of reaction, maybe even an apology from the guard, or a shout, something that would show that she had some kind of power in the situation. But the guard didn't give her the satisfaction. His silence was louder than any words he could have spoken. As the seconds passed, her smirk began to fade. It was replaced by an uncomfortable sense of unease. She had expected chaos, maybe even some sort of confrontation. But instead, she was met with a calm that made her feel small. The crowd around her was no longer focused on the guard's uniform, but on her. The attention she had wanted was now turning into something different, a sense of judgment. Still, the woman refused to back down. Her pride was too strong, and she couldn't let herself admit that she had miscalculated. She looked around at the people who were now murmuring and pointing. She saw some shaking their heads, others with expressions of disbelief. They were no longer sympathizing with her. If anything, they were starting to take sides. The royal guard had maintained his dignity, but her actions had made her appear out of control, reckless, and disrespectful. After a long, tense silence, the woman finally scoffed and crossed her arms, thinking she could intimidate the guard with her body language. But even that had little effect. The guard stood tall, never shifting his stance or his gaze. There was something about the way he held himself that demanded respect, even in the face of disrespect. The people around them were still talking, some with disbelief at what had just happened, others with curiosity about how the guard would handle the situation. But the guard didn't speak a word, didn't move a muscle. He was a living statue, embodying the calm and grace of someone who had been trained for moments like this. And as the minutes dragged on, the woman's confidence began to waver. She had thought her actions would stir the crowd, spark some sort of excitement, but all she was left with was silence and the intense gaze of the guard. The longer she stood there, the more isolated she felt. The crowd, once intrigued by her outburst, was now shifting their focus to the guard's calm professionalism. The woman's bravado was slowly melting away as the consequences of her actions began to settle in. The scene had taken a turn she hadn't expected, and the royal guard, in his unwavering silence, was the one who held the power now. The atmosphere around the royal guard and the woman started to shift dramatically. The crowd, which had once been a mix of curious tourists and indifferent passersby, was now fully focused on the tense standoff. People began to murmur amongst themselves, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Some, who had initially been entertained by the woman's boldness, were now looking at her with judgment in their eyes. Others were starting to feel sympathy for the royal guard, impressed by how calm he was under such pressure. The woman, who had once been sure of herself, now stood in front of the guard with no clear direction. Her smirk had faded entirely, replaced by an uncomfortable silence that she could no longer control. The coffee on the guard's uniform had started to drip slowly down, staining the white and red fabric. But the guard didn't make any move to clean himself, nor did he flinch at the discomfort. Instead, he stood still, a pillar of composure and discipline in the midst of the chaos. In the crowd, whispers grew louder. Some people began to approach the guard's comrades, who were standing nearby but hadn't yet intervened. There was a sense of anticipation, and it was clear that people were waiting for something to happen, something that would resolve the tension in the air. The woman, on the other hand, was growing increasingly uneasy as she realized that no one was coming to her defense. In fact, the crowd seemed to be against her, watching her every move with interest. The Royal Guard's colleagues, seeing the situation escalate, began to move toward the scene. They were well trained in handling all kinds of disruptions, and the moment they stepped forward, it was clear that the situation was now under control. One of the guards approached the woman, his presence commanding, and spoke in a voice that was firm but respectful. "Ma'am, your actions have disrupted the peace and disrespected a member of the royal family's security force," he said calmly. His tone wasn't harsh, but it carried authority, and it was enough to make the woman take a step back. The woman looked around in confusion, as if trying to find some way to salvage her position, but it was too late. Her earlier smugness had evaporated, and now she was left trying to justify her actions. "It's just coffee," she muttered, as if that somehow explained her behavior. But her words felt empty in the face of the calm professionalism of the guards. The onlookers, who had once seemed unsure of who to side with, were now clearly judging her. The guard who had been attacked didn't respond to her words. He stood there silently, waiting for the law enforcement officers to arrive. His unwavering discipline was beginning to have an impact on the crowd as well. His presence seemed to take the air out of the situation, leaving little room for any further outbursts. The woman, now realizing that she had lost the upper hand, started to fidget uncomfortably. She glanced around, her defiance slowly crumbling as she saw more and more people shaking their heads at her behavior. The moment felt like it had dragged on for longer than it actually had, and the woman could feel her confidence slipping further away. The attention she had initially sought now seemed like a burden. People weren't seeing her as a victim of some imagined slight anymore. They were seeing her for what she was, someone who had overstepped her bounds. The Royal Guard, in his silence and dignity, had become a symbol of restraint in the face of unnecessary provocation. As the crowd grew more engaged, some began to express their disbelief at what had just happened. Several people who had witnessed the incident began talking among themselves, discussing how they'd never seen anyone remain so calm under such disrespect. The contrast between the Royal Guard's stoic professionalism and the woman's increasingly erratic behavior was striking, and it was becoming clear to everyone who the real authority in the situation was. The woman had lost control, and there was no turning back now. As the Royal Guard stood unwavering, the situation began to take a more serious turn. The moment the woman threw her coffee, she probably expected a quick and fiery reaction from the guard. But instead, she was met with the complete opposite, a calm, composed, and dignified presence. She had no idea how to handle this new dynamic. The crowd, which had once been unsure, was now watching her every move, and the whispers were growing louder, with many people shaking their heads in disbelief at her actions. Realizing that the scene was getting out of control and that she was no longer in control of the situation, the woman's posture began to falter. The smugness she had initially displayed quickly dissolved into frustration. Her hands, which had been confidently crossed in front of her, now nervously clutched the sides of her jacket as she scanned the crowd. The crowd wasn't supporting her anymore, and she could feel the shift in their perception. They weren't admiring her boldness. They were questioning it. It was then that the Royal Guard's colleagues, who had been observing the situation from the sidelines, decided to step in. They walked forward with confidence, their presence immediately commanding attention. As soon as they arrived, the woman's posture stiffened. She might have been hoping to turn things around, to turn the tables and regain some control over the situation. But she now realized that the guards were not there to make excuses for her behavior. One of the guards, a tall figure with a stern face, stepped directly in front of her, blocking her view of the Royal Guard. He spoke in a calm but firm voice. "Ma'am, your actions have caused a disturbance, and you have disrespected a member of the Royal Guard." There was no anger in his tone, just a straightforward acknowledgement of what had transpired. His words were authoritative, but not harsh. The woman's attempt to shrug it off as nothing more than an accident or mistake fell flat. The crowd, which had been quiet but tense, now began murmuring more openly. The onlookers had witnessed the entire incident and weren't just passive observers anymore. Some started recording the scene, while others exchanged looks, quietly disapproving of the woman's behavior. The woman's shoulders slumped slightly as she realized she was losing the public's favor. Her once confident stance was now replaced with defensiveness, but there was no denying that the situation was getting worse for her. "Why are you making such a big deal out of this?" the woman blurted out, her voice shaky but filled with frustration. She was trying to defend herself, but the words didn't seem to carry the same weight they once had. "It's just coffee, it's not like I hurt anyone," she added, though the comment seemed weaker than she intended. The royal guard, still silent and unyielding, didn't react to her words. He stood tall, his face expressionless, his body never moving from its original position. The guard who had spoken earlier, now standing beside her, remained calm. "It's not about the coffee, ma'am. It's about the respect and decorum that should be shown to those who serve in this capacity." His voice was steady, and he didn't raise it, yet his message was clear. The woman's mind raced. She had expected to get away with the act, to have a brief moment of defiance, but now she realized the depth of her mistake. The situation was no longer about her. It had grown into something larger, a lesson in dignity, respect, and how even the smallest acts of disrespect could have larger consequences. The crowd around them had stopped murmuring and was now focused, their attention completely on the woman and the guards. The woman tried to hold her ground, but she was increasingly aware that the situation had slipped beyond her control. The Royal Guard's colleagues maintained their position, and their calmness had started to have an effect. The woman's defiance was beginning to crumble, replaced with nervous energy. The more she tried to justify her actions, the more she realized that she was on the losing side of this interaction. As the law enforcement began to arrive, the gravity of the situation settled in. The woman's words became less certain, and the crowd around her seemed to grow quieter, more judgmental. The Royal Guard's steady presence had transformed what could have been a chaotic moment into a calm and controlled situation, one in which it was clear who had maintained the respect of those around them. The woman's frustration was beginning to reach its peak. She had tried to shrug off her actions, to pretend like it was no big deal, but it was clear to her now that this wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. The Royal Guard's colleagues were still standing by, unwavering and composed, as the crowd continued to murmur amongst themselves. The woman's eyes darted from one face to the next, hoping to find some sign of support, but all she saw were disapproving glances. In her mind, she had imagined the scenario going very differently. She had thought that by throwing the coffee, she would get a reaction. Maybe an apology, maybe a moment where the guard would show some weakness. Instead, she had been met with the complete opposite. The guard's calm, unshakable stance had only highlighted her own impulsive behavior. She could feel her control slipping away with every passing second. Now she was cornered. The guard's colleagues were firm in their stance, and it seemed that no one in the crowd was going to back her up. She attempted to hold on to the shred of confidence she had left, trying to find a way out of the uncomfortable situation she had created. She crossed her arms defensively, her jaw set tightly. But deep down, she knew it was too late. The words she had thrown out in anger felt hollow now, like they had lost their power. "Why are you making such a big deal out of this?" she repeated, though her voice was weaker this time. She tried to sound defiant, but it didn't come across the way she intended. The man standing beside her, one of the guards, looked at her with steady eyes. He wasn't aggressive, but there was an undeniable authority in his gaze. His calmness seemed to make the situation even more intense for her. The contrast between her emotional outbursts and his quiet demeanor was stark, and it only made her feel more out of place. "It's just coffee," she added, attempting to downplay the situation once again. But the guard didn't flinch. He didn't need to. His earlier response had been clear, and he wasn't going to be baited into a petty argument. The crowd, which had been watching her with increasing curiosity, now seemed to be waiting for something. They weren't paying attention to her anymore. They were watching how she would react to the consequences of her actions. The woman's attempt to justify herself felt increasingly empty. Her earlier belief that she could intimidate the guard with her boldness now seemed foolish. She had assumed that by provoking him, she could get a rise out of him, maybe even make him apologize. Instead, she had painted herself into a corner. Every time she spoke, it only highlighted the gap between her behavior and the calm professionalism of the Royal Guard. He was unmoved, his focus entirely on maintaining order, and her words seemed to fade into the background, overshadowed by his quiet dignity. As the law enforcement officers began to arrive, the gravity of the situation began to sink in. The woman's earlier bravado vanished completely, replaced by nervous energy. The officers approached the scene with calm authority, and they immediately began to take control of the situation. They began questioning witnesses, and soon it was clear that the woman would not be allowed to walk away from her actions without consequence. She shifted on her feet, her face reddening with embarrassment, as she realized that she had miscalculated the entire situation. The onlookers, who had initially been intrigued by her boldness, were now growing more and more critical. It seemed like everyone around her had moved on from the moment, but she was stuck in it, facing the full weight of her behavior. In a way, it was almost poetic. The woman, in her attempt to assert herself, had underestimated the strength of the Royal Guard's discipline. She had thought she could break through the guard's unyielding stance with a simple act of provocation, but she had ended up breaking herself instead. The crowd, the guards, and even the law enforcement had all seen through her. It was no longer about coffee or a moment of rebellion. It had become about respect and control. And in this contest, the Royal Guard was the clear winner. As the law enforcement officers arrived and began to take charge of the situation, the woman's sense of control slipped further away. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, and with every passing second, her discomfort grew. The whispers that had started softly now filled the air, and she realized that she was no longer the center of attention for the reasons she had hoped. The admiration she might have thought she'd earned with her boldness was gone, replaced by a sense of isolation. The officers calmly questioned the witnesses who had seen the incident unfold, gathering the details and assessing the situation. The woman, once so confident in her actions, was now standing still, her arms crossed tightly in front of her as she watched the process unfold. The onlookers, who had been silently observing her from a distance, seemed to be shifting their opinions. No one was taking her side anymore. They were all focused on what was happening now, the consequences of her behavior. The Royal Guard remained unmoved, his colleagues continuing to stand at attention by his side. They hadn't spoken a word of judgment or anger, yet their presence alone seemed to convey a message loud and clear. The woman had crossed a line, and the calmness of the guards had made it impossible for her to deny it. She had expected to rattle them, to provoke some kind of reaction, but instead, she had been met with nothing but dignity and professionalism. Now, the silence of the guards seemed even more powerful as the police handled the situation. The crowd, which had once been divided in their reactions, was now unified in their judgment. Many of the people who had previously found her actions amusing or bold were now looking at her with disdain. It was hard to ignore the shift in the air. The energy around her was no longer one of curiosity or excitement. It had turned into quiet disapproval. The woman could feel it, and it made her even more uneasy. As she stood there, her mind raced. She had no words to defend herself now. Every time she tried to speak, it felt like her words were falling flat. She had nothing to say that would undo what had happened. The coffee stain on the Royal Guard's uniform was a clear reminder of her impulsive actions, and the guard's unshakable calmness was a stark contrast to the chaos she had tried to create. It was becoming painfully clear that her plan had backfired in a way she hadn't anticipated. As the officers finished speaking to the witnesses, they turned their attention to the woman. One of the officers, a woman in a crisp uniform, approached her. "Ma'am," the officer said, her voice steady but firm, "your actions were inappropriate and disrespectful. This is not a matter we take lightly." The woman looked up at the officer, but her usual bravado was gone. There was no way to talk her way out of this now. The officer wasn't there to listen to excuses. She was there to enforce the consequences of the woman's behavior. The royal guard, who had remained quiet throughout the entire ordeal, was now at the center of the attention. His composure had not only diffused the situation, but it had also drawn attention to the woman's behavior in a way that she could no longer ignore. As the police took control, the crowd's whispers turned into murmurs of approval for the royal guard's professionalism and self-control. He had become a symbol of calm in the face of disrespect, and it was something the crowd couldn't help but respect. The woman, now realizing the full extent of her mistake, stood there in silence. She had nothing left to say. She had expected to be the one in control, to have the final word, but now, it was clear that her actions had only led to her own downfall. The royal guard had remained calm and dignified, and that was more than enough to turn the situation in his favor. The woman had been left alone to face the consequences, and as the officers prepared to take her away, the crowd began to disperse, their judgment sealed. The woman stood silently, her face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and frustration. The reality of the situation had finally sunk in. The attention she had once relished was now a heavy weight, and the support she thought she would receive from the crowd had evaporated. The people who had gathered to witness the spectacle were no longer on her side. Their gaze was on her, not with admiration, but with judgment. As the officers continued to handle the scene, they asked the royal guard for a statement. They wanted to understand the full scope of what had happened, and they were careful in their questioning, maintaining a respectful tone as they spoke to the guard. He remained composed throughout, giving nothing but a factual account of the events. His response was calm and measured, a stark contrast to the woman who now stood at the center of the drama she had caused. The royal guard's colleagues were still standing firm by his side, offering their support without a word. Their presence was enough to make the woman feel more and more isolated. It was clear that the guards were not only maintaining order in this situation, but were also providing a model of how to handle such an outburst with grace and professionalism. The police officers, who had already started to gather information from the witnesses, turned to the woman. One of the officers, a tall man with a calm expression, stepped closer to her. "Ma'am, we need to discuss your actions and what will happen next," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. The words felt like a weight pressing down on her. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Her mind was racing, but she couldn't find the right words to make her actions seem justifiable. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she muttered, though it didn't have the same conviction it once might have. Her earlier bravado was gone. She had thought she could get away with a small act of rebellion, but now she saw the seriousness of the situation. She had insulted a member of the royal guard, and there would be consequences for her actions. The officer nodded, acknowledging her statement. "It's not about whether you meant to cause harm, man," he replied calmly. "It's about the respect you show to those around you, especially to those who are in positions of authority." His words were not delivered with anger or disdain, but with a quiet understanding. It was clear that the officers were there to make sure that the right thing was done, and the woman's actions would not go unnoticed. As the police took her statement and began to explain the next steps, the royal guard's role in the situation became even clearer. He had not needed to react with aggression or force. He had simply stood his ground, maintaining the discipline and respect that his position required. The woman's outburst had been met with nothing more than quiet professionalism, and in the end, it was that very professionalism that had turned the tables in the royal guard's favor. He didn't need to defend himself verbally because his actions spoke louder than any words could have. As the situation settled down, the woman realized that she had miscalculated everything. She had thought that by making a scene, she could somehow gain control, make herself feel powerful. Instead, she had exposed her own lack of respect for the institution and its people. Now, as the police prepared to escort her away, she couldn't help but feel the full weight of her actions. She had thought she was challenging the system, but it was the system that had ultimately won. The Royal Guard's dignity and the calm response of the authorities had diffused what could have been a much more volatile situation. The crowd, which had watched the entire episode unfold, began to disperse. Many of them looked back one last time at the woman being led away, shaking their heads. A few had taken videos of the event, and soon enough, the story would be shared online, leaving a permanent reminder of the lesson learned that day. The Royal Guard's poise had made an indelible mark on everyone present, showing that strength doesn't always come from force. It often comes from standing firm in the face of adversity and maintaining one's dignity. As the woman was taken away, her defiance was replaced with a quiet, unspoken understanding of the consequences she had brought upon herself. The situation was over, but the lesson, both for her and for those who had witnessed it, would linger much longer. The quiet hum of the crowd slowly faded as the woman was escorted away by the police. The once animated atmosphere, full of whispers and murmurs, now settled into an uneasy silence. People were still talking, but the energy had shifted entirely. The onlookers had gone from curiosity and anticipation to a somber reflection on what had just transpired. They had all witnessed an important moment, a clear lesson in respect, dignity, and the consequences of thoughtless actions. The Royal Guard, standing tall and unwavering, had silently commanded the situation and maintained a sense of calm throughout the chaos. As the woman was led away, her shoulders slumped, her head down, and she walked with a pace that suggested she was lost in her thoughts. She had come to this busy public space, expecting to make some kind of bold statement, but now she was the one who had been made an example of. The Royal Guard had shown no anger, no retaliation, only a stoic presence that had left her with nothing to counteract. What she had hoped to be a moment of personal triumph had turned into her own public downfall. The officers who had come to manage the situation were now speaking quietly with a few witnesses, ensuring that everything was handled properly. The Royal Guard, after having given his account of the event, remained where he stood, his posture impeccable. His silence had been his strongest weapon, and it had proven to be enough to resolve the incident without escalating things further. His composure had not only calmed the situation, but had also prevented it from spiraling out of control. The crowd, which had once seemed divided, now seemed to recognize the power of quiet strength. The Royal Guard had been tested in a way that most would have found difficult to endure. Yet through his restraint, he had shown the true meaning of dignity under pressure. No words had been necessary. His actions had spoken louder than anything he could have said. The people who had been unsure or even skeptical at first now looked at him with a newfound respect. As the police car carrying the woman slowly drove off, the remaining crowd began to disperse, their conversations focused on what had happened. Some still filmed the incident on their phones, but now the narrative was different. It wasn't just a dramatic moment captured on video. It was a lesson. A story of how a situation that could have gone wrong had instead been diffused through professionalism and dignity. The Royal Guard had proven that sometimes the greatest strength lies in remaining composed when faced with disrespect or provocation. The incident would soon be talked about in the city for days to come, and no doubt the video would circulate, drawing attention to the importance of respect and self-discipline. The woman who had thought herself clever in making a scene was now the subject of judgment. Her actions had, in fact, done more harm to her than to anyone else. And yet, for the Royal Guard, this moment was nothing more than another part of his daily routine. He had trained for years to deal with such disruptions, to be the calm in the storm. As he stood there, watching the last of the crowd disperse, there was no sign of pride in his eyes, only quiet satisfaction. He knew his role, and he had carried it out with the same unwavering professionalism that he brought to every task. The crowd had learned something that day, not just about how to react to disrespect, but about the power of maintaining one's composure in difficult moments. The Royal Guard had given them all a reminder that no matter the provocation, there is always strength in remaining calm and dignity in standing firm. The woman's actions, rash and hasty as they were would be forgotten in time. But the lesson in restraint and respect that the royal guard had imparted would linger long after the incident was over.